For me, I think what is important is to find your place or your moment of calm. The two main outcomes that we would have someone who's an advocate, or what the research would show of a mindfulness process, is it kind of helps you train your attention to be able to sort of step back from your thoughts, and it also is a great way to reduce your levels of stress. We're only setting ourselves up to be more resilient.
Hey healthcare providers, you're listening to the Burnt Out to Lit Up podcast. Hosted by myself, Erica, and my husband, Michael. We're an OTPT team that understands the healthcare industry's got some serious issues.
Inspired by our own experience with burnout, we've made it our mission and passion to help you navigate your career in healthcare by cultivating wellness, growing both personally and professionally, and advocating for a better workplace.
Whether you are a clinician or manager, new grad or seasoned vet, join us each week as we share interviews, research, stories, and strategies that will give you the tools to go from burnt out to your most lit up self.
Let's dive in.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Erica, and my co-host, Mike, is missing today. He's at work, and we were supposed to record our intros for the show this past weekend, but we totally forgot. But if you're new to the show, welcome. And if you're returning to the show, welcome as well. And so today's episode with Dr. Sara McKay is fascinating. And I'm going to introduce her in a bit. But before I do, I want to share with you top 5 ways to de-stress in an instant. And this comes from a book that I've read on the show before called Calm, 50 Mindfulness and Relaxation Exercises to De-stress and Unwind by Dr. Arlene K. Unger. Go for a walk, chat to a friend or loved one, visualize something positive or hopeful, put on some music and dance, and take 3 deep mindful breaths. Now, all these things sound simple, but sometimes it's good to be reminded of these things because we can forget. And even something like breathing that we do automatically. For example, I got the Apple Watch for Christmas, and there's an app called Breathe. And at first I thought it was silly because I don't need to be reminded to breathe, but I'm actually in love with it because like I said before, I think in last week's episode, I don't always get to meditate with Headspace. It's my favorite app, but I'm not that consistent with it. And I like the Breathe app on my watch because in the middle of a day where my mind is running at 1,000,000 miles an hour, the watch sends me notifications throughout the day to breathe. So I'll start it and it vibrates to give me cues to inhale and exhale, and it lasts for a minute. And then at the end, it'll tell you, you breathed, it'll show you your heart rate, and then you can do it again. And I like it because it's very simple. It's simple, and that's why, it's easy to stick to. It's a great reminder, and, I'm all about mindfulness. So I especially love this cue to help to remind me to breathe, even though at first I thought I didn't need it. But now I realize how much more I'm incorporating mindfulness breaks throughout the day. And I think that's really important. And I also think that incorporating opportunities for creativity and flow into your routine, whether that's every day or on a weekly basis, I think that's so important because one of these tips was put on some music and dance. And for me, I was a dance major and I've always loved to dance. I haven't been dancing, for many years, but I'm making an effort to, when I take my breaks in the day, to put on music on Spotify and have like a 10-minute dance break. And that energizes me so much. Even though I work out every day, I was telling Mike this, and I was talking about this inside of the Joy Energy Time Club, which is our wellness subscription for healthcare professionals. I was talking about how every part of my day is purely functional. And I think as adults, this can definitely happen when we're focused on work and, maintaining the health of ourselves and our family members. And we don't necessarily have time. I mean, we don't have time because we're so busy, but we don't necessarily create the time to have fun or to play or to get into flow. So that's actually this month's theme inside of our club is creativity. So every month inside of the club, we pick a new theme, and there's also an optional challenge around the theme if you want to go deeper and implement whatever practice we're talking about, if you want to implement that into your life more. And we also create content around that theme. And so I like how we're focusing on creativity because now my daily dance breaks are something I look forward to. They make me happy and I want to choreograph again, not like professionally, but just for fun. I just really miss dancing and it instantly makes me feel happy. So do what makes you happy and do more of it, okay? So let me introduce to you now Dr. Sara McKay. She sums up her research with the words nature, nurture, and neuroplasticity. She is a neuroscientist and science communicator who specializes in translating brain science research into simple, actionable strategies for peak performance, creativity, health, and well-being. As the director of the Neuroscience Academy, Sara offers training in applied neuroscience and brain health for helping professionals. Sara has authored the popular science book, The Woman's Brain Book, The Neuroscience of Health, Hormones, and Happiness, which explores women's health from womb to tomb, I love that, through the lens of neurobiology. In 2019, she hosted an episode of ABC's flagship science TV show, Catalyst, exploring biohacking, brain health, and longevity. In 2020, Sara will take part in Homeward Bound, a woman in STEM leadership expedition to Antarctica. And I asked her about that because once I read that, I was really, really excited. Sara grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand, and after completing her neuroscience degree at Otago University, won a scholarship to Oxford University for her PhD training. After 5 years of medical research in Sydney, Australia, Sara hung up her lab coat to build a science communications business. Sara combines a wry sense of humor with an uncompromising mind, and whether she's writing or speaking on the TEDx stage, she tells science stories in a fun and compelling way. She's been featured in print media such as the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and Sydney Morning Herald, and can be seen or heard on SBS Insight, ABC Radio National, ABC Catalyst, and Channel 7 Mornings. Sara lives on the northern beaches of Sydney, Australia with her Irish husband. Together, they're raising 2 boys and a Cocker Spaniel, and they could be found sailing, surfing, mountain biking, or skiing. And recently, Mike and I skied, and it's terrifying. Skiing is quite terrifying, but I think if I practice it more, I'll get better at it, right? That's usually how it goes. Yes, for me, it was definitely like mind over matter. And once I started to relax, going down the baby green slope, I started to get more confident despite all the falls. But anyway, enough about me skiing. Let's welcome Sara to the show. And before we do that, if you haven't done so already, it means the world to us if you can leave a review or rate our show on iTunes. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you later. Bye. One of our club members, Danielle, wrote in one of the threads we have in the club, "It is so awesome to be a part of this community and to collaborate and empower one another to support optimal wellness and growth within our own practice areas." Woo! Go Danielle. I am so excited by how the club is turning out. The Joy Energy Time Club is our subscription-based private club for healthcare professionals. And inside the club, we offer resources to help you with stress management, burnout, enhancing your personal growth and your professional growth practices. Not only will you get these weekly resources, but you are also joining us at Joy Energy Time as a founding member, meaning you'll have early, very important person, VIP access to our upcoming products, events, and all the things we have in store for you. So when you join us, you are joining us in on our mission to live your most lit up existence, and you are joining a community of other healthcare professionals that are in it to grow themselves and to support one another. If you're interested in joining us, visit at joyenergytime.com/club, and you can join there. There are 2 options, either month to month or an annual subscription. Do what works for you. We can't wait to greet you and welcome you inside the club. Hi, Dr. McKay. Welcome to the show. I'm very delighted to have you here today.
Oh, thank you. It's an honor to be invited. Always nice to have the chance to chat.
Yes, and you have done so many, the other day I was binge watching a lot of your content on YouTube and getting a feel for all the things that you talk about. I'm so amazed by your topics. I know today is going to be a great talk, and I know so many people listening are going to be curious about this as well. And can you share a little bit with us about who you are and basically, in a nutshell, how you got to where you are today?
Oh my goodness, I don't know whether I can do it in a nutshell. I know it's always one's favorite thing to talk about is oneself and your career journey, but that's always nice. So I'm Sara McKay, and I'm not actually Australian. People listening, if they've got a good ear, may recognise that my accent's actually a Kiwi accent. So I grew up in New Zealand, but nowadays I live in Sydney, Australia, just a couple of hours away from where I grew up in New Zealand. And I guess, how did I end up where I am today? So I'm a neuroscientist first and foremost, and really that's been the kind of the North Star of my career ever since I discovered the kind of the wonder that is the science of the brain. So I was one of those kids who just loved reading. I always had my head stuck in a book. I loved learning. I loved school. Was very, very happy, just learning new stuff. And I think that love of learning's carried me through my whole life too. But when I went to headed off to university, and I was actually the first person in either side of my family to go to university. My parents both left school at 15. So, it was not really something that I knew much about the world of academia or science or research. I'd never really met anyone that even went to university before, let alone a scientist. I kind of knew my family doctor, and that was about the extent of it. When of course, university was this revelation of again, learning in the world of science to me. And in a first year psychology lecture, I had really kind of one of these great turning points in life when I was recommended to read a book by a neurologist whose name is Oliver Sacks. And the book has quite an unusual title. It's called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Now, if you've read the book, you'll be familiar with that book title. But it was really about a series of case studies of people who had very, very unusual neurological disorders. And in this particular instance, the man had a strange visual affliction where he would mistake common everyday objects for other kinds of everyday objects. And in this instance, he thought his wife was a hat. That's where the title of the book came from. And it was just absolutely, the book captivated me and really sort of set me on this path to discovering this field of neuroscience, which at the time, the early 90s, which probably dates me, the early 90s, I was at university. It's a very brand new discipline, neuroscience. And so I transferred to a university that offered that as a subject, still within New Zealand, Otago University. And I was one of the first cohorts to graduate with a degree in neuroscience back in the mid-90s. It was a brand new discipline that pulled together the brain and neuro components of psychology and physiology and pharmacology. And I was so excited by this idea then. And it's such an incredibly rich, deep, broad field that there's so much scope for this continued discovery and learning and new understanding. So I was very fortunate to win a scholarship to Oxford University in the UK, where I did my PhD, master's and then PhD in neuroscience. And then I met a beautiful Irishman. This is 20 years ago now, and on a whim we moved to Sydney in Australia. He's an economist, not a neuroscientist, and we're still married now and very happy here in Sydney. And I did a couple of postdoc positions in neuroscience, which is kind of like your early years training as a scientist. But as I kind of went through that training, there was a big part of me that loved the science. So the science is core to who I am. But I felt that there was a bit of a gap between a lot of what we were learning about in the lab and what we could apply to the real world and what the kind of the general public wanted to know about science, health, medicine, and what we were telling them. And so after a few years of soul searching, I left the academic research lab, which was incredibly hard to do, but I had to kind of follow my heart, and I set up my own business as a science communicator, which I still really do now in various forms, whether it's talking, whether it's writing, whether it's being interviewed on podcasts, whether it's speaking. I teach an online professional development program. I do a bit of radio and TV, really talking about science, specifically the brain. What do we understand from the world of brain research, and what can we use to make our lives, I guess, kind of healthier, happier, and higher performing. And that's what I spend my days doing. As I say, it's such a incredibly rich and deep discipline, this field of neuroscience, that there's always, every day I'm learning something new and fascinating and interesting, and then I get to kind of share that with the general public, which is really kind of, I guess, the heart of what I do.
Wow, yes, you've had quite a remarkable journey, and I'm so in awe. And by the way, I know you had mentioned you lived in Australia, but you're from New Zealand, and I should know. Yes. I should know better, because my friend's dad is from New Zealand, and she has half of her citizenship American and New Zealand. So I've heard her dad speak many times for many years. Yeah. That I should. Yeah. But you live in Sydney now, right?
Yeah, I do. We sound like hobbits. There's a few famous Kiwis. I think one of them just won an Oscar. So, there's a few of us out there doing our thing.
Right. Yes. And actually, I read, if I can't help but to ask, you're going on a mission to Antarctica?
Yes, I am. So I've been incredibly fortunate to be selected as part of a program called Homeward Bound, which is the aim is to train 1,000 women up over 10 years, so sort of 10 a year. But there's 75 of us this year who are going through a STEM leadership training program to kind of, give us a more of a voice in strategy, science, communications, and policy to sort of influence the health of the planet above and beyond the work that we already do. So that we're, the strength in numbers, and the tagline of the organisation is Mother Nature needs her daughters. And I think, as scientists, we need to band together, and the daughters, we need to be sisters. And as part of this program, we go on an expedition to Antarctica, and that'll be in November this year. So that's an absolute privilege to be part of, and to be meeting these amazing women who work in STEM and various different capacities globally, and what kind of power is there when we all come together and build our collective voice. It's going to be exciting to see how that pans out this year.
Oh wow, I bet. I can't wait. As soon as I read that, I was like, I have to ask you. That's so exciting. So that's great. And so I want to talk about now, like, the thing that you lights you up, and the thing that I know we're gonna get deep into, which is neuroscience and the brain. And I know you wrote a book about women's health from a neurobiology standpoint, and I like how you phrase it, from womb to tomb. So why did you choose, first of all, to study female brains, and what are some of the biggest misconceptions you have discovered in terms of the female brain?
Yeah, well, I didn't really set out to write this book at all. I'm far too much of a pragmatist. I don't know whether it's my Kiwi roots, very kind of down to earth. And when I was approached to write a book, I was like, oh, that sounds like lots of hard work. And I had no illusions of the glamour and the romance of writing. So I didn't really have any book ideas, but I was approached by a very charismatic and dynamic woman who'd been on to become my literary agent, who said, oh, let's just have a chat over coffee and we'll see what ideas we come up with. And she said, oh, what have you written in the past for an audience that's resonated with them? And at that time, I was doing some work for the ABC here in Australia, and I'd written an article on menopause and brain fog. And it was really taking from the angle that lots of women freak out at this point in life and think, oh, well, this experience of feeling foggy or emotional, forgetful is the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, and the idea was, no, it's not. It's quite normal. and you'll get over it and your hormones will level out and everything will be fine. And we had an enormous response. And my agent went, well, there you go, why don't you write a book on menopause? And I was in my early 40s at the time, and I was like, I don't really think that I had the experience or the interest to do that. Well, I'm 45 now, so, time creeps along. Seems a bit more relevant now than it did 4 or 5 years ago. But then she said, oh, well, what about this thing about baby brain? Is that a thing? And I always thought that was just a bit of a beat up. It was just not a thing. So I don't really think it's a thing. I'd never heard about it. It's not any, supported by any neuroscience that I know of, and realized that there were an awful lot of questions about female biology, reproductive transitions, perhaps, that we go through at different points in the lifespan that I didn't really understand the neurobiology of, which might come as a surprise to people, but as I said, neuroscience is a really big field. Mm-hmm. And I thought, it'd be really interesting to write a book about puberty and periods and the pill and pregnancy and menopause, and take a look at the female lifespan in a way through the perspective of neurobiology. And I suppose the biggest misconception that I have uncovered and that I went in is this sort of strong narrative that is not necessarily supported by the science in terms of women who are healthy, that hormones are the sort of the sole providers of our emotional experience, or hormones are the loudest voice in the crowd when it comes to what influences our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviours in terms of neurobiology. So I suppose it's a bit of a nature-nurture type argument, like, what is the determinant of who we are and our experiences as women? And I thought, well, it's going to be hormones. I mean, that's what it's. But I didn't have any background in this particular discipline, neuroendocrinology. So I sort of started delving into the literature, and what surprised me time and time again was various points in the lifespan that I looked at, or times, or certain ideas that we have, or we kind of default to blaming female hormones when things go wrong. It wasn't necessarily that the hormones were always at the core of what was going on. And for me, I suppose that was a big surprise. I mean, even today, scrolling through Facebook, I came across another, sponsored post where someone was talking about hormones as kind of the root cause of all of these issues to do with life. And all of these women going, yeah, of course, it's hormones. But when careful studies are done in many, many, many situations, whether we look at puberty, whether we look at things like PMS and the emotion, feeling grumpy and angry before your period, or this idea of baby brain, which I never believed in. Growing up in New Zealand, it wasn't something we talked about. Or postnatal depression even, or menopause. It's not always the hormones that are the cause of, they're one part of it, but they're not always the cause of perhaps a negative emotional experience. And there was we could get more specific if we've got time, of the various sort of studies I looked at that I supported that. Mm-hmm. Lots of people don't really like that message, but I think it's an incredibly empowering message, because we can't always do things about our hormones. You between puberty and menopause, and you're not on the pill and you're not pregnant, you've probably got a monthly menstrual cycle where your hormones go up and down. It kind of happens, but actually there's other things that have a greater influence over your personal life experiences, and that's great, because we can often do more about the social connections we have, or our stress levels, or other aspects of our life that we can manage. Hormones are just one part of that, and I really like to move away from that, I suppose, that message.
Right. There's a lot of different layers there, and I could see how seeing something online, I know there's so much misinformation online. So someone that's trained and, in your field, and you see sort of misleading content, it kind of, makes you angry, because there's so much more to, these topics than just one dimensional. It's all hormones, there's.
Yeah. And I guess it's probably worth kind of explaining in a bit more detail some of the studies that we looked at. So one of the, I think, ones, and I have 2 boys who are 10 and 11, and 11, so they're kind of tweens, as we say, entering their, early adolescence. And and I often hear, you know, when kids are moody or grumpy when they're 11 and 12, which they are, because life is really complex when you're starting high school and your friendship groups change and all stuff is going on. His mood is not a hormonal issue. It's because he started high school for the first time 2 weeks ago. He's cranky. He doesn't know anyone in his new high school. He's sad and lonely. And we have this tendency to, when things go wrong, even in boys, to go, oh, well, it's just hormones. So there was one study that I talked about in the book, which was looking at that emotional experience children have going through puberty. And we could look at for example, a little girl who perhaps enters puberty earlier than her friends, early but normal. Maybe she starts developing breasts when she's sort of 9, 10, gets her period maybe when she's 10. And that's young, but it's still within the normal range. It's early but normal. Now, the little girl who develops and goes through puberty far before any of her friends is far more vulnerable to develop issues around anxiety and depression than the little girl who goes through puberty around the same time as her friendship group or later than her friendship group. But quite the opposite happens for little boys. So when they enter puberty, the guy that enters puberty before his friends, and he kind of, what's happened when a boy, you know, starts turning into a man, he gets taller, hairier, his voice drops, he rises in social status in his friendship group because he's kind of almost becomes like the most masculine male within that group. Now he's protected against the emotional issues of adolescence that many kids experience, and much more so versus the boy who goes through puberty at the same time as his friendship group, and worse off is the little guy who goes through puberty much, much later than his friends. And most of us will be familiar with, you know, the little guy who still hadn't started growing even when he was 15 and 16. So we've got different kids here who all experience that onset of pubertal hormones at various points, different ages, but their emotional experience doesn't depend on the hormones. It depends on their friendship group, depends on what is going on within their social circle. And that is the stronger determinant of that emotional experience, not just the hormones. So I think that's kind of one example. Another example, which for me was perhaps the biggest aha moment I had writing the book, was taking a look at PMS, because I was interested again in this kind of natural monthly neuroscience experiment we've got going on, whereby, you know, what is the role of fluctuating hormones over the month, and how does that influence our emotional experience? Because if you look at social media again, PMS is this thing, you know, we all get cranky and moody in the week before our periods. Someone's grumpy, a woman's angry, you know, someone will turn around and go, oh, you know, she's on her period, or it's that time of the month. And then there's a very, very interesting meta-analysis that I uncovered. And if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's when lots and lots of different research studies are pulled together into one study. And there's kind of this power in numbers. The more data you have, you know, the clearer you can reach a conclusion. And this was looking at studies looking at PMS and particularly emotionality in that week before your period in different countries in the world. And bizarrely, the rates of reported PMS varied hugely by country. So in France and Switzerland in Europe, it was around sort of 10 to 12% of women said, yep, I get moody in the week before my period. You jump to Spain, which is right next door to France in Europe, and it was right up in sort of the 70%. So you've got about 75% of women there putting their hands up saying, yep, I get moody. And then you could go to other countries in the world. Iran was a bit of an outlier. That was at about 98%. So we've got some countries at 10, some countries at 98. Countries next door to each other can be the difference between 10 and 75. Wow. The hormonal fluctuations of these women are not varying that much. And I was like, how can it be that if it's biology, if it's ovarian hormones causing this, why are the reported rates so vastly different in different parts of the world, in different societies and different cultures? And there are some ideas that a large part of this is around the sort of the storytelling that we grow up with. What is the kind of the society's, expectation that women will suffer from PMS? And that seems to be a stronger provider of the emotional experience than the actual biology. So there's a women's health psychiatrist in New Zealand, Sarah Romans, who's looked into this problem as well, because she, obviously she's a particular segment of society who are coming to a psychiatrist for emotional issues. But she said, I just didn't believe every woman that came in blaming her hormones, the fact that she can reproduce, as the reason for her emotional distress. And so she designed a study called the Mood and Daily Life Study that looked at this. So women were prompted every day with a phone app to record their emotional status, and they were given positive and negative and neutral emotions to choose from, and the same numbers of each, because a lot of studies looking at women's emotional experience kind of may give them like 10 negative emotions to choose from and 1 or 2 positive. Well, of course, it's going to skew the data. It's not very scientific, and the assumption is your emotional experiences are only negative. So it gave them that. They also had to record how stressed they were, how physically healthy they were, how socially supported they felt in the day of their menstrual cycle. But the women were not told it was a study looking at PMS. So they weren't primed in any way to have any particular type of experience. Just what's your mood like every single day? And when many, many women's monthly cycles were gathered, the data was crunched, it turned out only about 1 or 2 in 20 women. So 5 to 10% of women had any clear variation of mood based on their hormonal status or based on day of the month. Their mood was far more likely to be influenced by their physical health, how stressed out they felt, but most strikingly by how socially supported they felt. So interesting, right? So we've got about 10, 15% of women maybe who do show clear emotional variations based on hormones, but the majority of women didn't. You get very, very different data depending on where you go in the world and conduct this study, when you say, this is a study looking at PMS, because then you're priming women to go, oh, how am I feeling today? Oh, maybe a little bit negative. Oh, well, I must be negative because my period's due in 2 days. And it automatically skews your emotional experience, because our modern understanding of emotions are that they are created moment by moment by moment by what is, our perception of what is happening in our body, the perception of what is going on in the world around us, and our expectations and our memories and our experiences. So we can create an emotional experience based on what we expect to be feeling. And as Sarah Romans, the psychiatrist, said, it's almost as if women have been brought up to believe that they have to feel bad at a particular point in the month, and therefore they do feel bad. We go to different countries in the world where PMS isn't part of the daily narrative, or families where it's not part of the daily narrative. Those women don't have the same emotional experience. So that's a bit of a long-winded way, I guess, for me to sort of explain, and there's various other sort of pieces of research that I uncovered writing the book, not going in expecting this is what I was going to find. It's this idea that we default to blaming hormones when things go wrong, when, it might be something else in your life, in particular what is happening within your social networks, same as the kids going through puberty. That may be the louder voice of the crowd itself, so to speak.
Wow, that is beyond fascinating research, and there's this strong psychosocial component there, and I'm blown away by this. I've never heard of this research before, so I'm just like in shock of hearing all of this. And this transitions me to think about the brain and your studies in the brain, and I know these are very heavy concepts, and these are things that are taught in like whole semesters, and I know these are things you talk about and more in depth in your course, but things like synaptogenesis, neurogenesis, and cortical reorganization, basically like concepts of neuroplasticity, and using that, knowing what that is, basically how can neuroplasticity help us when we're making new positive changes in our lives?
Well, neuroplasticity can't necessarily help us. Neuroplasticity is the means just by which the brain changes. So those various words you used, synaptogenesis, neurogenesis, and cortical reorganization, are just different types of plastic change in the brain, different ways in which the brain is able to be modified in response to experience, or how it grows and changes during development. So obviously an unborn baby and small children, babies and small children, their brains are growing and growing in size. And that comes about by neurons in the brain that make up about half of the number of cells in the brain continually dividing and multiplying. So that's the neurogenesis. We reach a point kind of late childhood where the brain stops growing and we don't make any more new neurons for the rest of life. There's a bit of debate about whether or not we make new neurons in our brains in adulthood. If we do, it's very, very rare. It's not the means by which the brain learns and changes in adulthood. It does that via other ways, by changing the structure and the kind of working relationship between neurons in the brain, what we might call the synapses, how those connections between brain cells form and change and grow. And really, there's lots of different ways that can happen. And all of those different means by which the brain changes in response to an experience is neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity kind of happens all of the time. It is the means by which change occurs. It is not something that helps change occurs. It's kind of how it happens. Mm-hmm. And it's really, there's lots of different ways that the brain can be modified. The thing is, as we get older and older and older, it gets harder and harder and harder for the brain to change in response to experience. And we kind of want that's kind of good, when you've got a little baby learning to speak and learning to interact and talk with someone and how to have a conversation and learn new words and learn new language. You really need the brain to be able to be completely modifiable and to soak up all that information and be wanting to learn. And that kind of happens up until about sort of 2 or 3 years of age. And after that point in time, you really do want that part of the brain to not be changing constantly, to almost kind of settle down and kind of get on with its job of doing what it does. We see these different sort of sensitive periods of development all the way through into early adulthood. And in fact, there's lots of really interesting new research looking at how incredibly plastic or shaped by the environment the teenage brain or the adolescent brain is, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is the bit behind your forehead, which is that very kind of human part, that the part involved with planning and judgment, short-term memory, being able to make rational decisions, and also things like higher order kind of judgment and reasoning, the things you might have to do if you were learning, say, algebra or physics or chemistry. The brain is not kind of disorganized during those times. It's primed to learn. So it's quite a good thing that teenagers are at high school learning quite complex subjects and being challenged cognitively, because their brains are primed to learn that stuff at that point in time. It's also during that phase that our brains go through a dramatic plastic phase of social cognition, so the ability to kind of interact and think about what other people are thinking and feeling, developing what we call a theory of mind, and developing skills such as empathy and skills such as emotional regulation, depending on what is happening around us. So the brain is kind of refining its skills during that point in time, and the means by which those skills are refined is the means by which experience in the environment can shape the brain. And neuroplasticity is just the word that we use to just sort of describe the kind of the biomechanics or the biology of how those changes come about. It's not necessarily a kind of a magic wand or a pill that can make change possible. It's just the means by which it happens.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I've read things like if you want to take advantage of and create new pathways in your brain, the phrase neurons that fire together, wire together, is that the correct phrase?
Yep, that's kind of a phrase that neuroscientists use, whereby I'm just sort of when we're talking about the connections between two neurons, how two brain cells might communicate or build a network of communication, whereby that kind of network controls the various behaviour or is involved with creating an emotion or perhaps helps retain a memory. The more times that experience is repeated, the more likely those neurons are to kind of work together as a group for a network to form. And when neurons are active and they're electrically active, we talk about them firing off electrical signals or kind of sparking activity. And so the more times a group of neurons within a network fires together, is electrically active together, the more likely they are to work together in the future. So we use this kind of phrase, wire together. You might get an existing network becoming stronger, or you might get a new network being formed whereby not new cells are growing, but new branches and new connections are being made between pre-existing groups.
Oh yeah, that's why it's important to never stop learning, right?
Yeah, and it's really to always keep kind of learning and cognitively engaged. And we have some really, we tend to think about, learning as being what kids do, and they're primed to do it, and they find it far easier than we do as we get older. The older you get, the harder it gets. It's still possible, but it does. You have to work a whole lot harder at it. But we know if we look at kind of brain health across the lifespan, and I wrote this book looking at the lifespan. So at each point in life, I think it's really interesting to think about how our life experiences have kind of gotten under our skin and into our cells in a way. One way we know to promote a healthy brain and good mental health throughout adulthood is to continually engage in what we call enriched experiences. So that includes ongoing learning, not learning stuff you don't want to necessarily learn. It might not be everyone's cup of tea to crack open a physics textbook, but to be constantly engaged and curious and really kind of immersed in understanding the world and the people around you, and constantly sort of challenging yourself in that way. And what that does is builds what you could almost think of as resilience in the brain. It builds cognitive reserve, and the brain then becomes more resilient to the ravages of aging and disease. A bit like if you an analogy might be an orchard of trees that you're kind of growing, and the more you water them and nurture them and tend to them, the more leaves and branches and fruit that they'll have. So when a drought comes, they're going to be more resistant to a bit of more resistant to a challenge than a tree that's never really been watered and hasn't really kind of got many leaves or branches. Neurons are the same. They're going to form more connections and more branches if we use them. There's not a shortcut. You've kind of got to challenge them. You've got to make them work hard. But doing that sets you up for brain health, as we get older. It doesn't matter whether you're 25 or 65.
Mm-hmm. Is good health really all in the mind? And can you think yourself into a healthier, happier version of yourself? Because I know there's so much on the internet right now and a lot of conflicting information about that. So I would love to hear what your
look, I think partly, but I also think that the self-help world is kind of, almost turned every issue into a real deeply personal issue. And if you have poor health, you must sort of had a bad mindset. You've developed a brain tumor. You must have thought it there. It's a negative attitude to life, and it completely fails to recognise that there's all kinds of socio-political, geographical, systemic issues that get people into this situations they're in. Maybe they grew up in poverty and had a really bad start to life. Maybe they live somewhere in the world that's incredibly polluted, or is trying to manage climate change. We've just had these terrible fires in Australia over our summer. It's been an incredibly horrible summer. It's really negatively impacted some people's health because we've been breathing bushfire smoke. Children have been breathing bushfire smoke for months. Luckily, their fires are out now because we've had a lot of rain the last week. But people are getting sick, and it's not because they've thought themselves sick. It's because of things way out of their control. I do think having the right knowledge base and skill base, we've got to understand that people are going to be more likely to be healthy if they're well educated and have the means to be able to implement what they've learned about taking care of themselves. Attitude is one part of it. I do think that if you have all your ducks in a row, you've been brought up in a healthy, loving family, and you're well nourished and you're exercised, and you live in a healthy environment, then you can deal with mindset issues. You may be able to then kind of go to that next level and think about, well, what can I do to reduce my stress? Because we know that if you reduce stress levels, you're less likely to become unwell and less likely to be susceptible to perhaps lifestyle diseases. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's a lot to be said for having a good attitude. But we need to have all of the systemic stuff in place. We can't blame someone who's unwell for having a bad attitude to life when a lot of the time there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. And I guess a lot of my issue with this kind of world of self-help, where it places all the blame on the individual, it fails to recognize that most problems don't necessarily stem from the individual. It's almost a bit like what I was talking about earlier. Not every emotional experience you have is because of your hormonal status. You're far more likely to be in a difficult emotional position if you're poorly socially connected. You don't have a good, strong friendship group around you, or you're transitioning into perhaps a new, like my son, to a new high school where he doesn't have a social support network yet. Mm-hmm. That is a systemic issue. Luckily, he's gone to a great school that's really good at all the pastoral care around kids beginning high school, and they focus on that. So I think having a good attitude is really useful if you have also got a lot of the other issues dealt with. The power of the mind is incredibly powerful. If you told stories, you're going to have a negative emotional experience because of your period coming. You probably will. Likewise, you can, think yourself well again in some circumstances, but you can't like cure a broken bone by thinking happy thoughts. Mm-hmm. You can't think away stage 4 ovarian cancer. I have a very dear friend who's in that circumstance. She's got stage 4 ovarian cancer. All the positive, happy thoughts that she has in the world aren't going to cure that cancer. We're hoping that, medical treatment will. We don't know. Can you alter your perception of your experience around things like pain, perhaps stress, perhaps discomfort, perhaps your experience of a health event can be influenced by your attitude, but that is not a failing if it doesn't work for you. And I think the self-help world needs to take a look at itself and this kind of focus on blaming the individual when things go wrong.
Right. That's to me, just such an accurate description of the self-help world right now. And I've seen, I'm just so in it, so I consume like so much of it. But like I know, I just agree with so much of what you said, because you're right. You can't cure a bone with happy thoughts. Yet we can, our perceptions of pain and like, especially that mindfulness component, like mindfulness has helped me to just be more realistic with things, and it has helped me to approach life better. But I also know, I'm not a wizard. I can't just wave a wand and have all that I want. So it's all these different concepts. But in terms of, mindfulness, how does that affect brain structure?
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of does to a certain extent in some people. So again, I think it's a bit of a privileged position lots of us come from, being able to talk about being mindful in our daily lives when some people are, fighting for survival. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's, this mindfulness is really great for many people in many ways. I do have a bit of a hesitation, I guess, around it as well, because I think, it turns that focus automatically inward to oneself. It's not a way of naturally connecting with other people and building networks. It's quite self-focused, not self-centered, because it's about self-care, but it's quite inward-looking and self-focused. So there's a great deal of research out there supporting, for example, having a mindfulness meditation / meditation practice in your life. For me, I think what is important is to find your place or your moment of calm, because I guess the two main outcomes that we would have someone who's an advocate, or what the research would show of a mindfulness process, is it kind of helps you train your attention to be able to sort of step back from your thoughts, and it also is a great way to reduce your levels of stress. And if we can find ways to buffer or manage or cope with stress, whether it be an imagined stress or a real event in the world, we're only setting ourselves up to be more resilient and to be able to cope with that better. But there are many ways that we can do this beyond just sort of that kind of idea of seated breathing and not kind of struggling internally with your thoughts. I personally don't have a mindful meditation practice, a seated breathing practice, because I just find it kind of hard work and annoying and frustrating, and I quite like my thoughts. And I have other ways in which I can achieve the same results. So I'm a massive advocate Well, personally, I love an afternoon nap. I have 20-minute naps most days if I can, and sometimes it'll be a bit earlier, particularly if it's I'm freaking out and I'm stressed out, or I'm ruminating over something, whether it be my family or myself or the climate. A nap will help me reset in much the same way that sitting for 20 minutes meditating may help someone else set. I also do things like I read a lot of fiction. I really like a good police procedural. I just find that just switches my brain off from the inner chat, and I'm focusing just mindfully on the words in the book. Or I walk my dog a lot by the sea. We go to the beach a lot. So I've got lots of ways to find my place or my moment of calm that for me have the same benefits. We do have some really great sort of brain imaging studies looking at people who are what I would call professional meditators, perhaps Buddhist monks, or people who have a very dedicated mindfulness meditation practice. And we do see some slight changes in brain structure in these people, but you would expect to see in any professional person who is particularly skilled in some kind of task. Mindfulness meditation isn't particularly magical task to do to change your brain. I mean, London taxi drivers have a slightly larger hippocampus than London bus drivers because they have to learn to navigate around the world. You know, an Olympic diver is going to have part of their brain involved with kind of balance and body movement is going to be structurally slightly different to someone who sits at a computer all day. So any profession, and I've talked professional meditators say, may show slight structural changes. But broadly speaking, for most people, it's a useful practice to help reduce stress levels, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, so a little 20-minute nap really helps to reset me too. And whereas my husband can't nap, because like if my husband naps, it's for 2 hours, but for me, a 20-minute nap, like
you got to set an alarm. I could sleep for I could nap for like 5 hours, and I could still then turn around and sleep 10 hours at night. I have to set an alarm. I don't magically wake up, but I'm a bit of a fan of the afternoon nap.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note that mindfulness doesn't have to happen in one way for everyone, of sitting silently thinking about nothing. Like you can achieve like mindfully reading or just being mindful in the activity that you're participating in. Is that basically like what you're talking about? Yeah,
I guess not necessarily even being mindful about the activity you're in, but for me it's not so much that process of mindfulness, but what are we trying to do by being mindful? Usually we're trying to gain some degree of control and sort of separation from our thoughts, because in many people they're very negative. And I guess part of me has always been like, but I quite like what's going on in my head. I don't really need a break from it. If I do need a break from it, I've got other ways of doing that instead of having to rely on my own training or willpower. But for me, I see it as a bit like there's lots of ways to get physically fit and healthy. I could swim. I love ocean swimming. Lots of people would never go near the ocean to swim. They'd be scared of sharks. I think it's kind of interesting when you see a shark. Other people might be into CrossFit. Someone else might be into long distance running. They're all ways to kind of achieve the same result. I'm not particularly evangelical about one thing or another. I just kind of like what I do, and really what's the result that you're hoping to achieve, rather than being evangelical about that actual process to get there. I think lots of people find a bit of relief when I tell them this, because there's quite a culture of mindfulness is the only path to whatever, feeling good, saving the planet, being the best person that you can be. I think there's lots of ways to climb that mountain, and right now mindfulness is the one that seems to be getting all of the positive attention. Yeah, sure, there's research to support it as well, but for those of us who it doesn't work for, that's okay. There's other ways to get there too.
Oh, that was wonderful. I'm so glad you touched upon that and expanded on that. I think a lot of people feel, I can't do mindfulness, something's wrong with me, or I can't meditate, or, but I think that's so important to know. So thank you for expanding on that. And, to wrap it up, I know we've talked about so much, and we could probably do like 3 more hours of this, because I love the brain and I love the body, and this is so fascinating to me. But I want to ask you, for people listening, what is the biggest takeaway that you want to impart to those, like from your book? If someone reads your book or listens to your speeches, what's like the biggest message you want people to take away from your work?
Yeah, well, in New Zealand, we've got our wonderful Indigenous community, the Māori community, have this saying, and it goes in Maori, and I'll translate it, Hei aha te manui o te ao, and it kind of poses a question, what is the most important thing in the world? He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. And that translates to the people, the people, the people. And as I said throughout the book, and I've only touched on just a couple of ideas there, time and time again, every researcher I spoke to, every kind of point in the lifespan, it was like, well, what's the kind of the most important thing we can do to help nurture a newborn baby, to help a toddler learn how to speak, to help a new child start primary school, to help a teenager struggling with starting high school or, going through puberty. What can we do to help someone who's anxious or depressed? What can we do to help a mum going through pregnancy and a new mum, and even mums who have been mums for a while? What can we do? What's the great scourge of old age? It's that kind of, the cost of survivorship. It's loneliness is one of the most strongest influences over our health. One researcher I've met said there's nothing disease likes more than to get its teeth into a lonely person. And I think, that's saying the people, the people, the people, they're the loudest voice in the crowd, and that's what we should be mobilising. That's the infrastructure that we should be building around people to support them. There's, as I said, this sort of the self-help world kind of encourages people to look for the answers inside, and then what if they're not there? Typically, we need to be looking at, being good neighbours, being good family members, and not just, people are pretty good at helping others when there's a disaster. How can you be a good neighbour when it's not a disaster scenario, when there's not bushfires or floods or storms? For me, I think a social prescription is really overlooked, and the disconnection and so many of the problems that we're seeing right now are around that kind of, we're so busy looking at ourselves and taking photos of ourselves on social media that we've forgotten to actually look at the other people. And for me, a social prescription is what we all should be writing each other.
Oh, wow. And this reminded me of something that I've recently, well, not so recently, but in the past few years have come across about this concept of social belonging, how it's actually essential for our survival and for our brain health. And I actually, I want to ask you like one more thing about what is that social prescription, because I think that's a powerful note that we can end on.
Yeah, I think it's about being part of some kind of group of people, whether it's, one as part of a couple or part of a team or part of a family where, we can go, not what's happening to me, what can I do about it, but what's happening to us and what can we do about it. The power that comes from me is nothing compared to the power that comes from that collective we. So what can, and it sounds silly, so go and join a group, go and join a team, but it's about being part of a group of people who have kind of got a greater purpose than just the individual. What are we all kind of working on together? And I take that on board. Like, I'm not just talking about this stuff. I actively seek out opportunities for me to be involved with groups of people I was just at a meeting at my son's brand new high school this week, and I joined in being a community parent. Now, I run a business. I'm a really busy person, but I make time to join groups because I think community is just so important. I'm part of my local community theatre group. We've got 3 rehearsals a week. Last night we rehearsed for 4 hours on a Tuesday night. I am a busy person, but I still make time for collective group activities because that is the most important thing that we can do, is to build that up. And it's interesting, I talk about my son. He's struggled moving to a new high school without any friends. And he's come from a primary school where he was like, Mr. Popular, and he's got a great bunch of friends where he comes home every day, and they've all gone to different high schools, so they're not all riding their bikes together around the neighbourhood like they were a month or two ago. He's been playing on Fortnite a lot, which if you've got young lads who have heard of Fortnite, online gaming, I do not have a problem with him coming home and doing that for an hour or so after school at the moment, because that's his way of reconnecting with his really good friends. That's just his like kind of digital skate park right now. He's exhausted. He's come home from school. He's just automatically finding that social connection in whatever way an 11-year-old boy can, So I just think that he kind of knows what he needs as well. And I think that I mean, that's kind of what I would say. I wouldn't tell people fortnight is the answer. I'm not saying, I'm just using that as an example of him connecting the way he needs to. And that's what a social prescription is facilitating and enabling and allowing that kind of friendships and love to be there. That our life story is one of we, it's not one of me.
I love that. I love that so much. I mean, that resonates so much with me when I'm doing with my business, the community I'm trying to build. And I think that's wonderful. That's what we are craving. I think at this moment right now in the world, we're just craving to get back in touch with people. And you said, like so perfectly depicted, the selfies and this and that, but who are your neighbors, who are your friends, who's your community, whether it's online or as long as you have a community, you're a part of something. So that's great.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Where can people find you and connect with you and learn more about you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm not sure whether by the time this comes out, my website's just being completely rebuilt and looking 1,000 times more beautiful than it does at the moment. At the moment, you can find my website is yourbrainhealth.com.au, but it's flipping over to drsarahmckay.com soon. I'm not sure when entirely the timing of this podcast and that will join up, but you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. On Instagram, I have to look it up, I'm a bit hopeless. I'm Sara Mckay, SaraMareemckay, and I talk lots about, I'm sure you'll have links, I talk lots about kind of brain stuff, and I try be as kind of entertaining and light-hearted and informative as I can be about different aspects of neuroscience. And of course, I teach an online program. It's a professional development program for people who work within the kind of the brain, mental health, coaching, therapy, psychology space to sort of, help those people within that, the helping professions, learn more about the brain and apply neuroscience to the work that they do. So there's lots of different ways people can learn a bit more about me. And buy my book.
Yeah, I'm going to have, when we release this, all the correct links. So if you're listening, don't worry about having to memorize. And we'll have all the correct website and everything for you to click on. But Dr. McKay, I so appreciate you taking the time to come on here and to talk about these topics. And this has been so interesting for me. So I'd like to thank you. And I always ask my guests at the end of an interview, what makes you your most lit up self?
Oh, it sounds just a bit sad to say. I just really like reading new neuroscience research. That's just who I am. I love it.
I never have any judgment. I've had people come on here and say that eating a cheeseburger lights them up, or spending time with their family, or getting involved in work. So every answer is just their answer, and work lights me up too. So no judgment. Thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, thanks so much for the invitation to chat. It's been a pleasure.